As we all remember, the best gang in the world came from Denmark. Egon Olsen, its boss, invented the plans with no imaginary limits. Stunning in scale, and his friend, Kjeld and Benny, carried out these ideas with so different from their everyday clumsiness. The owners of Franz Jaeger's safes threw up their hands in despair. The police scratched their heads. Everything had gone perfectly. And yet, in the end, something always went wrong. Dreamed of move to Mallorca was drifting away into an indefinite future, and the Vridsløselilla prison gates was closing again behind Egon Olsen and his brilliant mind. Today, the European Commission is planning a heist that would put even Egon Olsen to shame with its sheer scale. It's, of course, the seizure of Russian assets. And yet, despite the scale of this, the failure could be even greater than the one that befell the lovable Danes in each episode. When the Russian special military operation in Ukraine began 3 years and 10 months ago, it was easy to determine the war goals of each side. The Russians acted instinctively. For them, it was primarily to prevent NATO military installations from advancing several hundred kilometers toward Moscow. For the West, it was the implementation of the same ever-present scenario current since the days of Zbigniew Brzezinski. On this grand chessboard, wresting Ukraine from even friendly relations, not mentioning the Russian control, was supposed to be the final blow to the Russian Federation, propelling Moscow not even the local POW. Today, however, after nearly 4 years, it can be said that the war is now solely about money. After all, Russia achieved its goals. Even Volodymyr Zelensky was forced to admit that Ukraine's membership in NATO is now absolutely impossible. The West also knows that instead of weakening Russia, it has significantly strengthened its international position. Moreover, it has seemingly permanently redirected it towards trade and political relations with the global South, especially China and India. In short, the West undermined everything in Russia that was calling for another détente, another appeasement, another glass of cognac with Western partners. In this situation, the West is left with a consolation prize. If we read the peace proposals circulating among world capitals, it's already quite clear that the main disagreement, the one that divides Washington on the one hand, Wall Street, if you will, with Europe, the City of London in particular, and the European Central Bank, on the other, is the question of who will get their hands on Russian assets, previously frozen in Western deposit funds. Trump's proposals clearly stated that America would take at least $100 billion of these funds, then invest them or use them for the so-called reconstruction of Ukraine. In other words, it would recover, and Trump says this openly, at least some of the money that was poured into supporting successive Kiev regimes. The counter-opposition, or opposition, from London, Berlin, and Paris is simply a declaration of the European financial sector's interest in the distribution of these funds. As you are probably already aware, these events are accelerating. A few hours after you watch this program, the European Commission will likely reconvene and, during this upcoming three-day meeting, will make further decisions regarding the fate of at least 210 billion euros, which is frozen, primarily in Belgium, in the Euroclear Fund. 194 billion euros of this amount is currently frozen there. The decision has already been made to freeze these funds indefinitely, meaning they won't be renewed every 6 months, but will essentially be permanent. But the more important decision concerns whether the interests on these funds will be used as before, or whether it will be possible to simply seize the capital itself. This is precisely the question for those participating in this discussion on how to end the conflict in Ukraine. Who should take more? Of course, this amount of frozen Russian assets isn't fixed. It's constantly decreasing, as certain sums are periodically deducted directly from capital itself to compensate Western entities that have found themselves under Russian sanctions. Consequently, they have lost their assets and profits from operations in areas subject to European Union and Russian sanctions. There's very little talk in the West about the fact that this economic war between the West and Russia is a two-sided affair. And it's not as if Russia is simply taking blows it can't respond to because, after all, the financiers are Western. No, it doesn't work that way. 18th century pirates supposedly had their code written on human skin, and the same applies to modern pirates, meaning bankers and financiers, who operate independently of the heavily propagandized arrangements of the so-called international law. They have their own strict laws regarding finances, flows, funds, and investments. They have their own tribunals and courts. These are primarily the arbitration centers, including those located beyond the political reach of the European Union, such as those in Geneva, Hong Kong, and London, because the city is still one of the world's financial centers, and it's not as if it's taking any political side. The city, like any other financial center, is committed to its own profits. And that's the case here, too. Russia is defending itself. Russia is striking back, but Russia is also suing the others. Just a few days ago, a group of independent, non-governmental organizations with no non-Western affiliations, personnel, or other ties prepared a report outlining the possible consequences of seizing all Russian assets for the purpose of laundering them as part of the so-called reconstruction of Ukraine. This report, prepared under the auspices of the Veblen Institute for Economic Reforms and organizations like Friends of the Earth, Power Shift, and others, also serves as a warning of sorts. The authors aren't advising the European Commission or others involved in the heist of Russian assets simply not to do that. They're just stating that it will come at a cost. Because there are already 28 cases pending before arbitration tribunals, involving claims from various entities, not only Russian, but also Belarusian and Chinese. Entities seeking payment of amounts specified in the clauses of contracts signed before the escalation of the conflict related to the breach of these agreements as a result of sanctions imposed against Russia and Belarus. The total amount of these claims is currently estimated, and I repeat, the authors admit they don't know about all of them. So what they already know is at least $65 billion, roughly the amount European Union countries have already provided Ukraine with military aid. That's simply the same amount that will now have to be paid to companies from Russia, Belarus, and China, as has already been transferred to Ukraine, irrevocably, as Kiev had to admit. Of course, someone might say, "Don't threat us. It's still a long way off. Arbitration proceedings are taking years, and yet the Kiev case is justified." Well, yes, but that's not quite how it works in finance. This isn't BBC, and you can't just talk like that here, hoping no one will notice, and yet we all know they're lying. This is finance. If there is a claim accepted by the arbitration tribunal, and these claims are accepted and are being considered, it is necessary to create reserves that will block the funds of the defendant states, at least up to the amount of the claims, to guarantee payment. This is how it is done in finance. Otherwise, it constitutes a breach of financial discipline. Moreover, these arbitration proceedings must be legally supported, which is extremely expensive, and all of this burdens the budgets of both the defendant countries and the European Union, which, guess what funds, whose funds will come from? If we look at these lawsuits, they are very diverse. The lawsuits against Ukraine, of course, primarily concern the urgent removal of competition for Ukrainian oligarchs, especially financial competitors, or those who bribed the wrong people before a full-scale conflict. For example, a lawsuit against Ukraine was filed by a Chinese consortium linked to the finance tycoon Wang Jing and his aircraft company that invested $4.6 billion in Ukraine and was subsequently sanctioned and removed from Ukraine in 2020. The Ukrainian side is, of course, also a defendant in this case. Similar lawsuits are being filed by banks and investment firms, and the defendants include France, the United Kingdom, and Canada, which has the world's most pro-Banda rights government. Of course, there's the European Commission itself, there's Cyprus, Germany, but also Lithuania, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Interestingly, among those filing lawsuits are companies operating and registered within the European Union, for example, in Germany. After all, as we've always been taught that capital has no nationality and knows no borders. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is more or less how it's going. And it poses a very serious threat. What I'm saying is that if the European Commission actually decides to seize not only the interest, but also the assets themselves, to then launder them in Ukraine, and for companies or entities in both the financial and investment sectors to then claim them as part of reconstruction contracts, then we'll still face lawsuits, of course, with proportionate amounts filed by the Russian side. From the perspective of the Euroclear Fund, which I mentioned earlier and which holds 194 billion euros in Russian assets, the most heavily involved fund, such lawsuits will apply to 80% of its total assets. It holds a total of 229 billion euros. The assets of 103 central banks are deposited there. If threatened with such actions, they will simply withdraw, flee elsewhere outside the European Union to avoid being hit by the shrapnel of this massive financial war, the devastating consequences of which for the European economy could be far worse than simply pouring money into Kiev's bottomless pit. Russia will have no choice but to seize the assets of any European entities still present in Russia, and they still do, as European countries still have such agreements and contracts with Russia and have not terminated them so far. Therefore, it can seize them, but it will also be able to take retaliatory action in other financial markets, beyond the scope of the European Commission and uninterested in supporting the European Central Bank and saving the euro. Therefore, these assets could be sought anywhere. Moreover, the fundamental principle of not touching state assets deposited abroad will be undermined. From the perspective of countries like China and the Persian Gulf states, Europe will lose any credibility whatsoever as a financial market. And although confidence in the euro is already weakened, the euro as an international currency will simply cease to exist. Euroclear and other financiers who appear skeptical about this entire brilliant plan of the European Commission are, of course, consoled by the fact that they themselves will lose nothing, because the European Union member states will create a guarantee fund for them, which can be used as part of these proceedings or against Russian lawsuits. Germany has already declared its participation in such a fund amounting to 52 billion euros. Just think about it. Who will contribute the rest? Because that's only a quarter of what we're talking about. And who, of course, is always first in the fight, first in the pay, and, under the current government, very eager to emulate Germany. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is truly a brilliant leap. The financial sector, linked to Eurocrats and controlling them, want to steal not only the interest, but also the entire large Russian capital, then launder it in Ukraine, and recover it, multiplied by whatever financial assets may still be removed from Ukraine. Furthermore, this same money will then be returned to the financial funds and banks from the European taxpayers' packets, from my and your wallet, as because, after all, we guaranteed this great heist. Ladies and gentlemen, it must be said that precedent has already been set. Last year, two Russian millionaires, Peter Avin and Mikhail Friedman, leaders of one of Russia's major banking groups, Alpha Bank, successfully won their legal proceedings against the European Commission, and there will be more such losses on the European side, but again, no one cares, because they them the same money back. They'll find their prize in your pocket and in my pocket. So it must be said that, well, for all his genius, Egon Olsen didn't invent such a brilliant, in this primitive way, mechanism of double plundering. On the one hand, from the Russian side, of course, participating in the war, but on the other of ourselves as well. From us, who have nothing to do with this war and want to stay as far away from it as possible. Well, comparing these criminal minds, Egon Olsen was at least nice and funny, and they are not.